developers for the session, the last session for today, I think. Not? Louder, please. Louder, okay. My name is Christoph Wallenhaupt. Most of you probably know me already. So I've been a FoxPro developer for a long time, and I'm also a .NET developer and a web developer. International speaker, I'm speaking internationally very fast and not so loud. And I'm also a former contributing editor for Fox Advisor and for many, many other magazines. And back in the time when Microsoft supported FoxPro, I also was an MVP. Okay, this session is about getting to know PHP and showing the differences between VFP and PHP, and how you, if you know something to do something in VFP, how you can actually translate it to PHP code. And because positive things are usually, everyone has their own opinion, I'm really telling you what this session is not about. So it's not about installing and configuring PHP. I'm not doing this in this session. I'm not going through how you create a web application or how you actually develop in PHP. I'm not introducing you to any PHP frameworks like Laravel or Symfony. And I'm not talking about popular PHP products that you probably know, like WordPress, Drupal, Magento, or Joomla, all those content management systems. So this is all things I don't do. It's really about VFP and PHP, because I know a lot more about VFP than about PHP. There are lots of people in the PHP world that can do a better job at explaining how you do things in Laravel, how you create PHP applications. So this is about bridging the mind gap between being a VFP developer and being a PHP developer. So PHP, the mascot is not a fox like for us, it's an elephant. The PHP fans, it's because PHP looks kind of like an elephant. This has been created by Colin Vibrock years ago. So PHP is, in my opinion, an interesting solution for FoxPro developers who have to use a different language because they cannot do it in FoxPro because the customer doesn't want it, because it has to run on Linux, or for many other reasons. For a simple reason, PHP started out as a programming language that wasn't directly aimed at developers. It was aimed at web designers or at content creators. And it started procedural, just like FoxPro, and became object-oriented much later. So it has the same history. So if you go from VFP to PHP, you can use the same techniques that you use in FoxPro. You can basically switch on your level to PHP. You don't have to do all the new stuff, all the modern stuff at once. Unlike, for instance, in JavaScript. If you use a JavaScript framework, you really have to know a lot of things about JavaScript and closures and all kind of frameworks and package managers. And you can do PHP without doing anything. So you can just do it like a FoxPro 2.6 application, if you want. So from the language families, there are basically two that we use in business applications. One is basic-like. FoxPro is one that is basic-like. A lot of scripting languages are basic-like. Ruby, SQL to a certain degree is basic-like. And the similarities of basic-like languages is that the code is line-based. And if we need more than one line of code, we have a line continuation character. For us, it's a semicolon. It's the underscore for Visual Basic, and it's a curly for scripting, and a backslash for Ruby. But we have to tell our interpreter that the line is not yet finished, that the command continues in the next line. If we have block-based commands, we use a name for that block, and we have a begin and an end. So we have a for and for if and if, begin end in SQL. And then there's the other family, that's a C-style family. That's like Pascal, Java, C#, JavaScript, Perl, most languages today, including PHP. So PHP is like all these other C-style families, is statement-based. You have a statement, and you end this statement by using a statement termination character like a semicolon. And if you have a block, it starts with a function call, the if function, the for function, the while function, and then you have curly braces at the end. In where the other code is. So it looks all like basically like C. which makes it for FoxPro a little bit harder to learn, because in FoxPro you use semicolon to say, okay, I'm not yet done. And in PHP you use the semicolon to say, that's it, I'm done. Let's talk about the tool set. In FoxPro, we have the advantage, we have an integrated IDE that is really everything, including the runtime environment if you want to. So you run VFP, and that's it. And if you want to install something, you install for VFP, and that's it. With PHP, it's more like with many other languages. For one, you install the runtime, and there are various implementations. Every PHP installation implementation is different. There is a PHP standard, but it can be configured differently. It can have different modules. It can have different extensions. It can have extra code. PHP is distributed in source code and compiled if you want to install it on a machine that is on a Linux-based machine. And that's just the runtime. You also need an editor. You can use a text editor, or you can use one of the integrated IDEs like ZenStudio or Eclipse, PHP Storm, Visual Studio Code if you want. I'm using PHP Storm because I've used Rider and ReSharper for a long time. That's from the same company. You also need the debugger. The IDE might have a debugger, but it's not actually debugging the code. There's an extension that you have to load into the PHP runtime that's actually debugging. So you have to install a debugger separately from the runtime and separately from the IDE. And if you want to run PHP in a web server, you also have to have the module that integrates with the web server, of which there are several available, each having different advantages and different disadvantages. And like most languages, there's no database integrated into PHP, so you also have to have a database. It can be a SQLite database, that's basically file-based database, but you have to have a separate database. There are installers, and on Mac it's Brew, like Homebrew. On Windows it's Winget and Chocolatey that are the most common installers. Usually you use something like Brew install PHP on the Mac, or apt-get PHP on a Linux machine. You can use Winget install PHP, but it's not installing PHP. It's offering you a learning course for JavaScript and PHP for just $9.99. So do not use Winget. Get the PHP installer from the PHP side. The program structure. Let's look at the program structure a little bit. Structure. PHP was initially for web development. So what we have is structure basic. Is that PHP started out, you had an HTML page, and then you put code into the HTML page. So it always starts with text. It's in text mode. This can be HTML, but it also can be JSON or plain text or whatever. It's just everything here is just outputted into the result stream. And then you use the PHP tag to tell PHP that the next part is code. So this is code, and this is being executed by the PHP runtime engine. And then you end this block, and you can have more text code. And you can mix and match these. You can have multiple HTML blocks and multiple code blocks. There's also a shortcut like this one, which means that what follows is an expression, and this way I'm using a date function, so it's just outputting the current date and time, and it ends at that point. So this is like kind of like a inline print statement or text mesh statement. So if I run this, you see that I have the text here, and then there was the hello world from the code, and then I have something else and the current date and time. So then PHP is usually, people think of web development, a web application, but PHP also has a CLI, so you can actually create scripts that run in a terminal or on a command window that execute PHP code. That's how we extended our FoxPro DOS application when we needed to access the web and implement web services. We just had a PHP application that we called from FoxPro and had a dbf extension in PHP that was reading and writing to dbf files. But there's one major difference between PHP and VFP. It does not have an event loop on a GUI. You cannot create a desktop application in PHP. There were some attempts. There's a lot of Electron browser-based applications out there that embed the PHP web server. But a PHP application usually is one that starts, does something, and then terminates, and does not stay around. And that has impact on the design. In a desktop application, in FoxPro or in JavaScript and single-page applications, we usually have some initialization code that we do all kind of things, so we only do them once in the startup base, and we create all kind of objects and tables and all kind of things that remain around for the entire duration of the application. As long as we are using the application, all these objects, GeoApp and all of these objects are staying around. That is not the case in PHP. So PHP programs do not a lot of things in the startup, because every time PHP is called, it starts anew. It doesn't remember anything from previous calls. It doesn't, variables don't stay around. It's like you have a form, and in the click event, you're actually using a run command to execute the same application again to do something. That's how PHP works. Every time, it's actually executing a new instance of PHP. There are ways to optimize this, but it starts, runs, ends process. It's not something that stays around, has an event loop, and waits for input. So let's look at a few language elements of PHP. So what does PHP look like? So first of all, every PHP file starts with the PHP tag, as we have established. Most code these days is not mixing HTML and PHP. So it's basically a program that starts like this, and then everything else is PHP code. Variables in PHP, you can just assign them. They are created the first time you write into a variable. PHP, just like C, is case sensitive. So uppercase A and lowercase a would be different variables. Then we have something like an if block. It's if function, the condition. It's if A is less than B. We can use expressions. Echo is the print command. Every line has to end with the semicolon. A function call is just like in FoxPro. We use the function name, and parentheses, we pass any parameter we have. To define a function, we use the function statement. It's followed by the function name, the type, and the variable name. And then we can indicate the return value. Void means there's no return value. So a void function is something we would probably call a procedure in FoxPro that's doing something. And yeah, question.
We've had a request from the external audience to maybe just show the code. So is there a way you could make the code window bigger or the font bigger and maybe hide that left-hand sidebar?
Yeah. It's one of these things you. That better?
Let's see what Jody has to say. Jody wants it, so we got to make it happen.
Yeah. I think I bump it up a little bit more. So, okay. For loop is using the C style condition as long as this condition is fulfilled, and then we do this and the code in between. The strings in PHP have an embedded text merge. If you use the double quote, it's actually using text merge expression, except it can only use variables and properties. It cannot use entire complex expressions. So the $I means put in the content, whatever is an I, at this place, even though it's a numeric value. If you use single quotes, it's just a literal string. It's just the string, and every $sign something in there means print the $sign and the something. And then we also have some constants, like the new line. This is, if you want to print another line, or just print a full line, then you need to include this, either that or the \n, or a break, or something in HTML. In previous version of PHP, you had to use a and tag at the end of the PHP file, otherwise it was invalid. This has changed, and you should not use an and tag, because every single byte that follows the and tag is being output into the result stream. And because you include a lot of files in PHP, what I had in this application is I was creating PDF files instead of HTML files. And some other library that I was using had an end tag at the page and then another line break. So I ended up creating a PDF file that had a line break in a place where the PDF file could not have a line break, and it was an invalid PDF file, just because some other file did not have or did have an end tag. So just avoid the end tag, PHP end tag here. PHP is object-oriented, so you can actually create a class. It's using class and the class name. Properties are defined by using the type and the name. And you also have like private or public to define the visibility. Methods are just defined like a function. You can use public and private or static. Use the function keyword, then the function name, parameters, and all of this looks exactly like a function definition that we've seen before. This is a variable in PHP, so you have to use $ this. We get to this a little later. So this is how you assign a property. This is how you access a property within a string, automatic text merge. And if you have a return value, you specify the type and then use the return statement. So it actually looks pretty much like FoxPro, except they use all the semicolons and it's case sensitive. So new is the way you create an object. So the create object function is just new and then the class name. Any parameters that go to what we call the init and they call the constructor is placed in parentheses. And then you can just execute methods and access properties. So that's what the result is. We also have inheritance if we want to. So we can have an animal that eats, and then we can have a dog that extends an animal and additionally barks. And then we can create a new dog and bark and eat. Or we can use a cat extending the animal. Cats don't eat, they are being served. So, but this shows that you can actually override a method just like you are used to in FoxPro. So we don't have to make a method virtual of anything in order to be able to override it. You just redeclare it and it's overriding. And then obviously you need to have a is being served method. And barking and being fed. So that's PHP. So we're done. No. The question is what's different in PHP. That's actually the thing that makes it hard to start a new language. And it starts with variables. So we have an m dot in FoxPro. It indicates that what follows is a variable name. The same thing, PHP has the same thing. It's just a $. And unlike in FoxPro, where it's optional, in PHP it's mandatory. You have to use a $, even in cases where we would not use m dot, like when we pass by reference or when we, for certain functions, when we use arrays. This applies even to things like this, which we wouldn't see as a variable, but as part of the language. But in PHP, it's a variable. And you have to use $this in order to access the current object. There's also self in PHP, which is a keyword and doesn't require a $. Self accesses static members, and this accesses instance members. The naming rules for variables and properties are basically the same as in FoxPro. A variable starts with a letter or an underscore, and everything that follows can be a letter, underscore, or number. You cannot have a digit as the first character in a variable name, but you can have digits from the second letter on. The difference with FoxPro is it's case sensitive. PHP has different data types, just like FoxPro has different data types. So a string is a string, and a float is a float, and an int is an int. But variables itself are not typed. So a variable can have a string in one and an integer in the next moment. where we used Hungarian notation like LC name. PHP used comments that specify the type. So they have a program called PHP that was able to do something with these documents. So they do not use something like LC or CNAME. They just use name, $name. There are types in PHP. You can define a property as a type. You can define that a parameter has a type and the return value has a type. And PHP only checks the type when a value is assigned to a type property, when a parameter is passed to a function, or when a function returns a value or does not return a value. In between those operations, you can pretty much do what you want. So let's look at an example for that. Function, variable function call. So I have a function that receives a string. I pass a string. If I wouldn't pass a string, I would get an error message here, because passing a value to a function that has a type parameter is actually checking the type. I cannot say my func5, but I can then assign whatever I want to that variable. So I echo text, and then I assign 5 to the text, and I create the sum of those values. So the parameter is a string parameter, but it can change the type at any time. Variables are not typed. Parameters are typed, but as soon as the value is inside the method or inside the function, it becomes just a variable, and those are not typed in PHP. Also, method types are not checked before execution. So in order to realize for PHP that the return value is wrong, that something doesn't work, it has to execute the method. So I have the function, this function returns a string, and a string plus a string doesn't work in PHP. So when I run this, I get an error message. But you see that I still have this line executed, and then it failed. After the two methods have been, or functions have been executed and returned a value, then it realized, oh, those two are strings. I can't add up strings. I cannot get the sum of two strings. And then it reported an error, even though the function were defined as string functions. And in theory, PHP could have figured out before calling the function that the type doesn't match. So it's always executing the function, waiting for the result, and then it's telling you that this didn't work. VFP has also automatic type conversion, that is converting types as it sees fit. And there's a way to kind of make it strict, but that's really not strict. That's like our strict typing that we have in VFP. So it's hit and miss. The basic problem is in PHP, you have no local statement. So you cannot declare variable. Variables are created automatically when they are being written to. So let's look at a few operators, unless there are any questions so far. No. So unlike most C-style languages, PHP actually has an and an or. So you can say if this and this or this. You don't have to use the ampersand operator or the double pipe operator. Those exist too, so you can use both if you want. And they are not identical. One has a higher precedence than the other one. PHP, just like VFP, optimizes expressions. So if we look at example like this one, you can see that in the first two samples, let's run this. The first two lines, I am printing 1 and 1. And the second example, so this function is being called, my function is being called, it's actually printing the 1. No, it's not being called because it's true, sorry. This is not being called. The function here is being called, and the comment is wrong. So whenever the result of the first operator, just like in FoxPro, cannot, if a condition has to be true and it cannot be any truer, like true or something, it's will be true. And if a condition is already false, ending anything will never make it true. So just like FoxPro, if you have an operation that is slower, you want to put it on the second part of the end. You do the quick check first, and then you do an AND on OR for the slower checks. And question, yes.
Does it work for mathematics 0 times?
Say it again.
Does it work for mathematics 0 times something?
Mathematics 0 times.
Yeah, if you have 0 times the first part of multiplication is a 0.
I have no idea if it's doing the same thing for multiplications of 0. I don't know. It's just for AND or it's optimizing those, and it's not calling the second part. Some languages are actually calling the second part and only then come up with the result. So if you access a property, you actually do this in PHP exactly like in VFP. You use the single arrow operator. So just like you use print _screen arrow caption or _screen arrow hide, you do the same thing in FoxPro and PHP, except most of us are not using the arrow operator, even though it's a valid FoxPro syntax. We use the dot operator, and that makes things a little bit harder for PHP, because PHP has a dot operator, but it's not the same thing as in VFP, and we cannot use it in place of the arrow operator. So you have to use the arrow operator in PHP in order to access a property. And it's also not a work area operator like in X# or in Clipper. So because the dot operator is actually the string concatenation operator. So string combines those two strings. You don't use the plus operator like we do in FoxPro. And that can introduce some problematic bugs in if you write code that looks like VFP code. So say you have a string A and a string B and you want to concatenate. Most editors tell you that this is not working, and they recommend that you actually use the dot operator instead of the plus operator, because that's what you use in PHP. If you are using an editor that does not show this, you only see the arrow at runtime, just like in VFP. It can introduce some really hard to spot errors. Assume we do 2 errors at once. It happened to me, so it might happen. So we have a class that has a text property, and to define a property, we have to use the $ operator, because that's a variable declaration. And we also have a magic function, they call it magic function, that converts the class to a string. And we return nope. So now we create an instance of this, and we also create a text variable saying doesn't work. And then we mistakenly use the dot operator instead of the arrow operator. And then because we don't quite remember, do we have to use the $ for variables and properties, or both, or just variables or just properties? So we use the $ operator. And this line of code actually executes, it just doesn't do what we think it does. So when we run this, we get nope, doesn't work, nope from the object, doesn't work from the text variable, and both together because the dot is the string concatenation operator. If we use the arrow operator, which is what we would have to use, we get the correct value, which is hello world, because that's the value of the property. And if we use the dot operator and not the $, because that's what we remember we do with properties, we get an error in this case because text is not a valid constant. If we had defined a constant that would be a string, that would have been used instead. So this bug using a dot is one of those that I made the most time. That's my most common PHP bug, because it looks like valid syntax to a FoxPro developer, but it's not valid syntax. And it looks like valid syntax in C# too, and in JavaScript, just not in PHP. So, and we also have another source of bugs in FoxPro. There's an equal sign, a double equal sign, and a triple equal sign operator. In FoxPro, we only have a single equal sign and a double equal sign operator. The single equal sign operator in FoxPro is assignment and comparison. It's doing both. You can use variable equals a value to assign a value to a variable. You cannot use field equals value, which is kind of inconsistent, but that's the way it is. And you can use it to compare things. And when you compare values using the single equal operator, it's using the current collate sequence, and it's using a kind of different settings like set exact and all of these things. And then we have the exact comparison operator in VFP, the double equal sign, which is meaning that it has to be binary identical. In PHP, the single equal sign is always an assignment. It's never comparison. The double equal sign operator compares for equality. Are two values equal? And the triple equal sign is identity. Are two things the same thing? And this leads to a couple of bugs that we made when we worked more than in PHP. So we wrote code like this. Variable is something. If variable is value, then we print variable is value, and otherwise we print variable is not value. Looks perfectly to a FoxPro developer, and you notice the editor is not complaining at all. There's no hint that this might not work. Because it's valid PHP code, what it does is it takes the variable, assigns this value to the variable, and then looks if this variable is empty or not. And because I just assigned a value, it will never be empty, so it will always be value. So parse value, not something, because I assigned it. And it doesn't tell you. And most ifs, we tend to put the happy path in the if and the unhappy path in the else. So we are not testing whether it's actually going to the else part. It's always going to the if, what we expect. So this is one of the mistakes that is easy to make in PHP. So you actually have to use the double equal sign operator. There are also other things that PHP does differently from FoxPro. So if we do this on FoxPro, it would error out, invalid type. But in PHP, it's actually executing all of this. So PHP is doing a automatic type conversion. So if I compare a number and a string that has a digit in it, PHP is converting the string to a number. It's automatic doing a val. Because this is equal, because for VFP, the value of conversion is just 5 is 5. Only if I use identity, then I'm also checking whether the values on both sides are identical, like in type, from the instance. And in this case, I get not equal. This also applies if the string is actually not looking like the ones. If you have a 5 and a 0, 5, those are equal because PHP is converting to a number. If you have something that can't be converted, like an A, then you get a non-equal. You don't get an error message. You get a not equal because 5 is not equal to A. It's only if you use the identity operator that you're actually considering the type. So int 5 is the same as a float 5, but it's not identical to a float 5 because it's different binary presentation. It's a different type. So these things can have unexpected change or unexpected consequences because it depends on the data in your table, whether PHP is converting something or not. So if you compare something with name or a street and have an address field, that starts with a number. And if someone entered only the street number, then you suddenly might be able to compare to a number. For objects, just using the equality operator is like object comp in VFP. It's comparing whether the property values are identical. If all properties match, those two objects are identical. Only if you're using the, if I change things, then they are not equal. So if you want to actually compare the object instances, you have to use the identity operator, the 3 equals sign operator, instead of the 2 equals sign operator. If you want to know if the two data objects have identical property values, then you use the equality operator in PHP. And because we don't have that in VFP, it's an easy source of bugs. So let's look at some other aspects. Arrays. Arrays in VFP are a special case. A variable is a value that is typed and an NTI, a location in one of the variable tables that we have. An array in FoxPro is an NTI for the array name, and then 1 or 2 indexes. So FoxPro is always using a special function to get an array value. An array value does not have an NTI. That has a number of consequences in FoxPro that we know. Like we cannot have more than 2-dimensional arrays. There is no 3-dimensional array in FoxPro because we only have 1 or 2 dimensions. If you have an array element, you cannot pass that array element by reference. You can pass the array by reference, but you cannot pass the array element by reference. And if you have an array, because an array element can only have values and not variables, you cannot put an array in an array in FoxPro. You cannot nest arrays. That is different in PHP. In PHP, arrays are associative lists, much like a collection in FoxPro. Every element you put in an array in PHP has a key and it has a value. If you look at PHP code, it always looks like there's an index because the default key is a numeric increasing value starting with 0. So the first element you put in an array, if you don't assign a key, it gets the key 0. And the second element gets the key 1. And PHP is using numeric values as keys as well as strings. You can even combine those. You can have an array element that has a numeric key and string keys all in the same array. And that is another source of problems in VFP for VFP developers, because the key can never change. Let me show you a sample for that. This one. So I'm creating an array that has 3 elements. This is a shortcut for assigning 3 different values to the array. I'm using the for each loop to display the array elements. Then I'm using a sort, something we know, which sorts the array. And then I'm going through for each through the array and display the result. And this is actually doing something that we would expect. I have 1, 2, 3 before I sorted. And then I have 1, 3, 2 because it's sorted alphabetically. So it looks like the array changed. It did. But now let's try another code that is similar to what Tamar showed us today, using a for loop where we actually use the index value. So we go from element 0 to element 2, and we display the element by index. Then we sort the array, and then we just have the same code here that displays the array 0, 1, 2, first, second, third element. And when we do this, we get 1, 2, 3, and after sorting, we get 1, 2, 3. Why? Because arrays in PHP do not have an index. They have a key, and the key does not change. The order of the array changes, but the first element is still 0, and the second is still 1, and the third is still 2, because that's the key and not an index. And it's an easy to make mistake because it looks like an index in FoxPro, but it's a key. And the order does not have anything to do with the index, what we use as an index. Any questions about that?
How do you fix that?
Well, you don't use the index. You use you have to use the key or use for each in this case, or use one of the other sorting functions where you actually can change the key.
The fix is in yourself. Is there any sense, any justification as why they even do that?
Is there any justification for that? Yeah, because it's an associative array. It's a list. It's not an array. It just looks to us like an array. It's actually a helpful feature that it automatically assigns an index so that we don't have to specify a key. But it's just a different concept. It just looks dangerously close to an array, but it's not an array. It's a list. And it makes it really, really difficult. There's also another type of bugs. And there are no two-dimensional arrays because an array is a list. It's a single list. So if you want to have a multi-dimensional array in PHP, you actually put an array inside the array. So the first row gets an array, and the second row gets another array. And that's multi-column arrays, except that because you create a different array for every row can have a different dimension and column. So you can have 100 columns in the first row and 2 columns in the second row. It doesn't have to be all the same like in FoxPro. So it's really more like the collection that we have seen today in Tamar's session. It's not an array. It just looks like an array. Variable scope in VFP. VFP scopes variables to the stack level. A variable belongs in a stack level in which it has been created, except for public, which are always created in stack level 0. If you look at FoxPro and you print the stack level, you see that if I just type in a command window, I'm in stack level 0. If I turn this in a program by highlighting the line and executing it, I'm now in stack level 1. That's one reason why if you define a variable in a command window, it's a public variable because it's created in stack level 0. Every time we call another program, we have another stack level, and we create variables based on the stack level. The visibility of variables on FoxPro is either they are visible from the level on which they have been created down, or just on the level they have been created. That's local variables. And when you create a variable, you have a couple of rules on FoxPro. You cannot create a variable on a higher level if it conflicts with an existing variable. You can also not create a variable on a lower level that hides a higher level. You can create. So if I have on a higher level one, I can create a lower level one that hides the higher level one. But if within one level, I can only redefine variables to one that have a lower visibility. No, that have a lower visibility. Let's look at code that makes it much more understandable. No, one program. So I create a public variable A, assign a value, then call a function and print the value. In this function, I create a private variable. In this one, I create a local variable. Because I'm creating variables that are lower in visibility on a lower level, I can do this in FoxPro, no problem. If I have a private variable here on level 1, and I'm trying to create a variable on level 0, on a higher level than the one that I'm currently on, then I have a visibility conflict because I'm creating on level 2, I'm creating a new variable that would be visible from level 0. So what I get is an illegal redefinition of variable A. We have seen that. This actually leads to some strange things in FoxPro. Not do MC, sorry. So in this case, I'm creating a local variable and I'm calling a function. In this function, I'm creating a public variable. And because on level 1, I had a local variable, which is only visible in level 1, I can create a public variable in level 0 while being in level 2. If I return and assign a value to that variable, I'm actually changing the local variable and printing the local variable. Then I'm releasing the variable, which releases the local variable, and suddenly the public variable that I created in the function becomes visible. So that's why we have 2, which is a public variable, then 1, which is a local variable. And after releasing the local variable, the public variable becomes visible, and we have 2. You just don't do this in reality in code. But it's a consequence of what we have in FoxPro. We also can use a variable before we declare it, except we have to make sure that the code is only executed after we have created it. but it's not the existence of the variable is not bound to the block or line of code in FoxPro. It's bound to whenever the runtime engine hits a line that uses a variable. So this is working without any problem. If I have a variable, like I have a private variable, and then I want to create a local variable, the private variable has a higher visibility because it's visible down. So I get an error for illegal redefinition. If I do the opposite thing, I'm creating a local variable and then creating a variable that had a higher visibility. I actually can do this. So in this case, I get my error message on the local statement, which would narrow down the visibility, but I do not get an error on the private. It's just turning the local variable in a private variable, which is visible down in function C. So that's visibility in VFP. In PHP, variables are only visible within the scope that they have been created in. Scope is where they are visible, basically, and PHP has two scopes. Global scope is everything outside of a function. Local scope is everything inside a function. Every function call creates a new local scope for that function call. So let's look at later time at a few samples. So global variables are not visible in functions because they are not in global scope. Functions are in local scope, so functions can only see local variables created in that scope. For that reason, we have a global statement in PHP that we have to use in order to make a variable or to create a local variable that contains a reference to the global variable. If we don't do this, we would use a local variable in PHP. There's some issues with that. If you include code, you create variables in the included code that is available to the code that included the code initially. Let's look at code. Code is always easier than text. That's variable, scope variable. So I declare a public variable, and that's public because it's outside the function. And inside the function, I have only access to local scope, so I don't see this variable. Editing tools usually detect this. In PHP, it detects it at runtime, but editing tools see that this is an undefined variable because it has not been defined inside. But if you have something like this where you want to write to a global variable, but forgot to use the global statement, then you're creating a local variable. And because that's a possible and valid PHP thing to do, you do not get a warning. So you actually have to think about that what we call a public is not visible in a function. You have to make it, you have to explicitly in the function say global this variable in order to have access to that variable. Question?
How is it for stack functions?
What functions?
If you stack functions, call a function out of a function.
If you call a function from a function, what happens? That question. Every function call creates a new local scope. So every variable in a function is from the calling function is not visible in the called function. Also, the globals you defined in the calling functions are not visible in the called function. You have to use the global command again. Every function has its own scope. So in order to use something else, you either have to pass it or you have to use the global command to access a variable on global scope. So it's not being based on the stack level like in FoxPro, where higher things are visible in lower things. It's really completely separate. Yes?
But it means I can global the call, the calling, the function that is calling me. I still can't address via global.
Can you access a variable from a calling function using the global command? No, because global is only those variables that have to be defined outside of a function. So if it's been defined outside of a function, you can access the global, but a function, a variable that is being defined inside a function is always local and cannot be made global by a function that you've been calling. So that's kind of irritating. So let's go to file scope. When you have languages that have files, you somehow have to define what file belongs to the project or what is visible. How does code know what files to look at? And in most languages, this is done by having some sort of a project and by building the executable, or the files that are in the project are being included or being compiled or being processed in some way. PHP does not create exe files. So there's no way that PHP knows what files in all those subdirectories actually belong to that application and which doesn't. So there's a different approach than in VFP. In VFP, what we have is, when we talk about a file being visible, we actually talk about two different things. The one thing we have is included versus excluded in the project manager, which is a static assignment. You cannot uninclude a file at runtime. A file is either built into the exe or it's not. And if it's built into the exe, like a bitmap we use in a command pattern, it's being part of the exe. It's always being available to our code. And it's something that other languages would use as a resource, not as a file. FoxPro has a virtual file system, read-only file system built into the runtime that accesses the exe. But then we also have dynamic availability by loading things like set class lib to, set procedure to, by having things in the calling stack. All procedure files or program files that are in the calling stack are automatically loaded because they're being executed right now. So FoxPro resolves the dependency. A dependency being it encounters a function call or a create object for a class and needs to figure out where that function is or where that class is. It's dynamic and doesn't depend on the position of the code. It depends on what class libraries are loaded, what procedures are loaded, what class libraries or procedures might be in the program cache, which have been executed, which are in the calling stack. It depends on how we define the search order for set pass to, or whether we prefer included files or versus excluded files using the sys function. And we also can specify a certain library or a certain module or certain procedure file using either the in command or use a parameter, or using the third parameter like a new object. New object takes the class name, the library, and then the module, the app file. So you can actually use it to load a class from a different app in a different class library. So all of these things define how FoxPro resolves things, and these things might change. So the same line of code in FoxPro can resolve to a different class or different procedure every time it's being executed. This is not the case in PHP. No, let's go back. VFP. We're still at VFP. FoxPro also has no problem if you have multiple classes of the same name in the same PLG or multiple procedures of the same name in the same PLG. It will just use the second one or the last one. That's because as it loads the PLG file, it just keeps a track of the names. And if you use the same name again, it just replaces the entry. So the last one wins. FoxPro also has issues with the cache. It behaves differently depending on how the procedure or program is named. If you have a program that is named like a variable, it starts with a letter followed by digits or letters, then it's being cached and treated like a function. If you have a program that starts, for instance, with an exclamation mark, which you can do exclamation mark myprogram.plg, then it's not being cached and it's searched differently. So FoxPro has really a lot of problems in file scope. PHP, remember, code runs just once. We don't have a setup like set this class library, load class library. We also don't have exes in PHP. So PHP has a simpler concept. It just has text files. There are no different formats. There's no report files, no class libraries, no menu files, no files that we need to generate. It's all text files. Everything that's not a text file is usually served outside of PHP, like the JSON files or just like JavaScript files or bitmaps. They are requested by the browser in the HTML that we created or in the JavaScript that we created. So basically what PHP does is, because it just runs once through the entire program, it generates one big program. And that's what's executing virtually. It doesn't do it physically, but it does it virtually. And the option that you have to merge things are including and requiring, which does basically the same thing, except that include issues a warning if a file is not available and require issues a error message. So let's look at this in code. Scope files. So my include file just says included. And I include it using include and include once. Then I require it using require and require once. And then I'm using a file that doesn't exist, which is the missing case. If I run this, we see when we use include, the first file was included, which is the include statement. The second time it wasn't included because we also have the variation of include once. Include once is something that if it has been included already, then do not include it again. Just include it once or require once. So you have the combination of including requiring, depending on whether the file is available or not, what should happen, and then include once and require once, depending on has this been included or required before. If not, do it not again. Require does do the same thing. It's including the file, because requiring and including are two different operations. They keep track of their own lists. A file can be included and then can be required again. But once it's been required, it cannot be required once again. When the file is missing, what we see is the include issues a PHP warning, displays it, and then continues executing. And it's displaying it twice because it's printing to standard output and standard error. So the console is displaying everything twice. The require line, which requires that the file has to be there, instead brings up a fatal error and then doesn't continue. It just terminates at this point because without this file, there's no way to continue execution. So that's the difference between include once, require once. So when do you use things? Include is something you use for templates files and config files, files that you want to have included at this place, at this point, all the time. If you have a config file in PHP that defines values, you always need those values, so you always include and require them. On the other hand, procedures and classes only have to be defined once. There's no point in defining the same thing over and over again. It just takes time. So you use require once and include once for procedures and classes. There was a question over there.
Yeah, I was just wondering about the case sensitivity of the files on disk when you're using require or include. Does it matter case sensitivity then as well?
Doesn't matter if the file names are uppercase or lowercase, case sensitivity for include and require. It actually depends on the operating system.
Okay.
So on Mac and Windows, it doesn't matter. On Linux, it does matter. And on Windows and Mac, if you enable a case sensitivity, which you can do, then it matters also. It's really a file system setting. So no. Unlike FoxPro, where you can have the same class name several times, and it just depends on how you call it, which class is being used. you cannot do the same thing in PHP. There's a global class list and there's a global function list. And I added this procedure because I still type procedure something in PHP and there is no procedure, it's always a function. So you have a global function list and a global procedure list. And if you try to do find the same procedure twice, in this case, I'm defining my func twice, something that works perfectly in FoxPro. But you notice that the editor is already complaining and PHP is also complaining with a fatal error. So it's actually canceling execution if you define the same file twice, the same procedure twice, or the same class twice. So now let's talk about things like autoloading. So PHP has a feature that's called autoloading that kicks in if a class is unknown, if it's not being in this global class list and it's not being included so far. And depending on the version of PHP you're using, you have different reactions. PHP says, it's not my problem. You should have included that. Then PHP 5, because that behavior in PHP 4 was kind of not helpful, included a __ autoload function. That function had to be declared once, exactly only once, and it received the class name and then could require or include the class file. This kind of seems like it should work, but if you have a lot of third-party libraries, then those third-party libraries depend on your application finding the correct class for every single class in the third-party library. So PHP 7 and PHP 8 introduced SPL autoload register, where you could register a function which is being called, and if you register multiple functions, those functions are just being called in the order you registered them. Because that's still very complicated, most PHP applications actually rely on the implementation of Composer, which is a package manager, to autoload things based on the file location. So if you have a class that is in a specific subfolder, then the namespace, to which we get in a minute, should match, and then Composer is able to find those files. It's actually creating a list of files and make them available. Let's talk about extensibility a little bit. In FoxPro, we have extensions. We can use set library 2, and we can use set classlib 2, and we decide at runtime what extensions we want. In PHP, a lot of those are built into PHP itself or can be loaded dynamically. Some can only be built into PHP, some can only be loaded dynamically, and some can be both. Some only run on Windows, some run on all operating systems. We can use PHP -m to list all the modules that are available. The problem with this building extensions into PHP is when you are using a managed server that someone else is managing that PHP installation, they decide what extensions are available, not you. You cannot just somehow load those extensions. They have to be loaded by PHP before your code is being executed. So in some cases, you write code that works on one server, but it doesn't work on another server because they have different extensions available or different version of those extensions. Also in FoxPro, you can have multiple applications on the same server, and they all use different libraries. You are not having one application, if two applications are on the same computer, they do not have to use the same FLL version or the same VCX. They can use different versions of those because they are separate applications. PHP on a server only runs usually in one installation. So all the applications running PHP have the same configuration and they have the same extension. So if one application requires an extension and the other does not work, if that extension is being available, then you kind of have a problem running those two apps on the same server. Debugging is another thing that is kind of weird. It's not included. It's an extension. You have to have an extension. So if your PHP installation does not have that extension loaded, you can actually not debug at all. Because the debugging API is something that is being used, it's using remote communication to talk to a debugger, and every time it executes a new line, it's telling the debugger what is being doing, and it's asking the debugger when it should stop. So they have this communication protocol between, and basically do remote debugging all the time. Because of that, we also now have no edit and continue in PHP. You cannot change a line of code in the PHP debugger and execute it again. That's not a big loss for VFP developers because we don't have that either. But if you have been using C# or other JavaScript, you're kind of used to be able to change the code and then continue. And that doesn't work in PHP. Database connectivity is another thing. There are many options. The most modern ones are ORM mappers, object relational database mappers, like Doctrine, Eloquent, or Red Bean. Those are the ones like Entity Framework is for C#, that's for PHP, the ones. Then we have something that is like ADO, PDO, which means PHP data objects, which is a class that can connect to any different kind of database if there's a PDO implementation. PHP can use ODBC. And then there are database-specific implementation as extensions that provide functions to the PHPs, like the MySQL or MySQLi extension that provides a MySQLi function that sends a SQL command to the MySQL server. And there's even a DBase extension, but that can only read DBase files. It has no index support. It has no support for complex data fields. It's basically DBase, no old version, just strings and numeric values and no index. It's a pretty small extension. So if you want to have a database, you not only have to make sure that the extension is available that you need, you also have to write different code depending on what extension you want. The most modern one is, as I said, ORM mappers or PDO. The other ones are the old versions. So let's talk about a few features that we don't have in VFP that we would probably have created if FoxPro wouldn't have been stopped by Microsoft 20 years ago, almost 20 years ago. PHP can do these things that we can't because there are just way more PHP developers on this planet than there are VFP developers. So even if every one of us is doing all kind of open source, we would never get that same power. And PHP as an open source product also started as using open source projects very early on. It's always been in the open source community. So one of the things is package managers. We have sort of a package manager with Thor that allows us to download components into the Thor repository and then use it from there. So we have most of those developer tools. Some are tools we use in code. But whenever you use something from VFPX, we have to integrate it into your project manually. And if there are dependencies, like code that is using one of the system drawing libraries or .NET Bridge from Brixtral, you have to make sure that you have the correct version installed, that all those libraries find each other. And if there's a version conflict, you have to deal with all of this manually. Package managers are actually doing things. You say, I need this on this library, and it's putting it into a vendor folder in the PHP project. And if that library depends on others, it's getting all those dependencies. And if some of those have different versions, it tries to find the version that fits for all of those components. That's what a package manager is doing. It's pretty common in .NET using NuGet and NPM for JavaScript. And it's called Composer in PHP. So you can specify from a list of components, of a huge list of components, which you want in this application. And then you get this integrated into your project, not just on the computer, but integrated into your project. And if there are updates available, you can update all those components to the latest version. And again, Composer manages all the dependencies that there are. There are actually two of them, Pair and Composer, and Pickle for extensions. Composer is the one that is the current one that most people use. Namespaces. If you have a lot of open source libraries, they tend to use the same names for classes. Like if you have an SMTP mailer, it's probably using mail or SMTP mail or mail message or something. And if you have multiple of those in your application, you do not want a conflict because every class name can only be used once in PHP. So you have to have a way to indicate what the name, a long name, without having to use that long name, and that's namespaces, like in C# or in other languages. So we actually specify a, let's look at namespaces include. So I have a class definition here that is using my class. It's using a helper class, and the class down here is helper, and I'm just putting in who am I. And I have the same thing in include B, and it's basically the same code, except that the namespace is project 2 in this one, and in this one is company project. And then I'm including those require ones, and then creating, it looks a little bit strange for a FoxPro developer, you use a backslash. Actually, you actually use a backslash on a Unix system here, and to distinguish it from a path. So that's a class name, and if it's a /, it's a file name. And you can use the full name in this case. And even though both classes just used helper in their own code, they're all and got a different helper. So one class is using helper 2, and the other one is using helper 4, because those classes resolve to the full namespace. So that's one of the features we don't have in VFP. The other one is closures. Closures is basically not only, but it's basically an anonymous function where you declare a function inside, for instance, another function call. Let me show you one example of that. So let's assume we have a logger class. And then we want to have different means of outputting, like logging in a console, logging into a file. So what we do is we create, we require that we get a function that's called a callable in PHP. And this function we store in a property. And then when we log strings, we just use that function and call it with the text that we got passed or that we modified. So to call it, we create a variable log to console and then create a function which just does logging to console. It's echoing this and also adding new line feeds. If I want to log into an HTML file, I wouldn't use new line. I would use a break, a BR tag, for instance. So then I can create a new instance of this logger and pass the log to console function, or this way the closure, to the logger, and the logger is using that function for all output operations. It's more like micro-substitution. That would be the closest alternative in VFP, because it doesn't depend on that the called function is finding the procedure. It doesn't have to resolve that. It's getting the function directly. Also, if you use variables that are outside that function, so I'm defining a function here using another syntax, using a shortcut syntax, a lambda expression. And because I'm redefining that function within the for each loop, value is actually each of those values. So I'm have this value defined outside the function. I'm using it inside the closure, and when I'm calling it, it's using the value at the time of the definition here in PHP. So this is actually printing all of those values in the array, whereas if I define the function at a point where value is 0, and then just use it in for each loop, I get the same results all the time. There's a way to tell a function to use a variable as a variable, a local variable as another variable, but unlike in JavaScript, you explicitly have to specify this in PHP. So closures actually make it easy to create dynamic classes where only a part of that class has a different implementation. And I'm getting to the end. What I have in the session paper is there's kind of a cheat sheet that has all kind of things once in down here at the end. at the end various things that how you write it in FoxPro and then the PHP equivalent, including things like the shorthand functions, where in PHP the characters that you want to search and want to replace have to have the same length, so you cannot remove characters. You have to use a slightly more complex thing if you want to remove characters. So this is what we've created over time, just to get a feeling for, I know how to do this in FoxPro, how do I do this in PHP? So there's a whole list of these things for all kind of different PHP things. So yeah. So I haven't told you how to set up PHP. That's your job. Sorry. But I did cover, and you learned how VFP differs from PHP, and that there are a couple of features in PHP that we do not have in FoxPro that would be really cool if we had them. And you also learned a little bit about how you translate VFP code into PHP. So thank you very much. And don't forget your evaluation. Yeah. I now have to go to